I once believed my parents were the only two people in the world who would never hurt me. I was bitterly mistaken when I invited them into my home to protect my pregnant wife. I had no idea I was handing her over to the very people with the most cruel intentions. Their scheme wasn't just about stealing our entire life savings. It was so ruthless that they were willing to gamble with the safety of their own unborn grandchildren. Of course, I will now provide the detailed, expanded American English script for Part 1, ensuring it meets the 1,200-word target and adheres to all the specified storytelling techniques. The decision that I believed would grant my wife peace throughout her pregnancy turned out to be the very thing that kick-started our worst nightmare. And it all began with a request that seemed so full of love, a request made to my own parents. It started when a job offer that felt like a winning lottery ticket landed in my lap. It was a short-term project manager position in another city, lasting only a single month. But the salary they were offering was a game changer. It was enough to ensure my family could live comfortably for an entire year, a financial cushion that felt like a godsend, especially since we were about to welcome not one, but two new lives into the world. My wife was 5 months pregnant with twins, and her pregnancy had been anything but easy. The morning sickness wasn't the mild inconvenience people joke about. It was a debilitating force that sapped her strength, turning her days into an exhausting loop between the bed and the bathroom. Some days, the only sound I'd hear from the bathroom was a dry, ragged heave that twisted my gut with a feeling of helplessness. Her doctor had been crystal clear in his warnings. She needed absolute rest and had to avoid any exertion, no matter how small, to ensure the safety of both her and the babies. A fierce internal battle raged within me. On one side was this career opportunity of a lifetime. On the other was the image of my frail wife, who needed me now more than ever. It was my wife, in her extraordinary strength, who urged me to take the job. She took my hands, looked me straight in the eye, and told me she would be okay, that I couldn't let this chance slip by. Her resolve convinced me, but on one condition: I had to find someone trustworthy to be with her, to care for her every single day. My initial plan was to ask her parents, but as fate would have it, they were swamped with their family business and couldn't find a last-minute replacement. With no other options, I called my parents. When I explained the situation, they agreed with a surprising level of cheerfulness and enthusiasm. I can still remember the wave of relief that washed over me as I listened to my mother's voice on the other end of the line. She even said something that at the time only warmed my heart, but in hindsight, it sends a shiver down my spine. She said, "Of course, son, family has to lean on each other, especially when money isn't everything." I was completely at ease, confident that my wife would be enveloped in a loving environment. The relationship between her and my parents had always been wonderful, so not a single seed of doubt was planted in my mind. I left for my business trip with a light heart. The first week, everything seemed perfect. Our nightly video calls were filled with laughter. My wife told me my parents were taking incredible care of her, cooking nutritious meals and not letting her lift a finger. But during one call, she casually mentioned an odd detail. She'd overheard my mother on the phone with someone, her voice a little tense, talking about an investment that needed to be sorted out soon. She didn't think much of it, and neither did I at the time. I just assumed it was their usual business dealings. But then the cracks began to appear. They were tiny at first, almost imperceptible, but they were enough to plant a seed of worry in my mind. Starting the second week, I noticed a distinct change in my wife's voice. It lost its lightness, became thin, brittle, like a leaf in autumn. The laughter that used to bubble up effortlessly now sounded forced, a pale echo of itself. Our conversations became shorter. When I'd ask about her day with my parents, her answers became vague, generic statements that everything was fine, that she was just a bit more tired because of the pregnancy. She started deflecting my more detailed questions when I pressed her, asking if my parents had done anything to upset her. She would just go quiet for a moment, before telling me not to overthink it, that it was probably just the hormones making her more sensitive. A husband's intuition told me something was wrong. That feeling of unease grew with each passing day, like a dark cloud slowly gathering on the horizon. I offered to end the project early, to fly home immediately, even if it meant paying a penalty for breaking the contract. But my wife adamantly refused. She insisted that she didn't want to ruin this huge opportunity for me, that there was only a little over a week left and she could handle it. Her choice of words, "handle it," kept me up at night. Handle what? I tried to reassure myself that she was probably right, that I was just being overly worried. The long month finally crawled to an end. The moment I stepped through the front door, I was hit by an unusual tension. The house was immaculately clean, almost unnaturally so, clean to the point of being sterile, but the air itself felt heavy, thick with unspoken words and a chilling tension. My parents greeted me hastily, their eyes darting away from mine, and they made a flimsy excuse about having an appointment to get to before leaving right away. Their eagerness to depart sent my internal alarms blaring. Left alone in the suffocating silence, my wife threw her arms around me, and I could feel her entire body uncontrollably trembling.
Wow.
She buried her face in my chest, and then whispered a sentence that made my heart clench. "I have to tell you something, but you have to promise you won't get angry right away." I thought I was prepared to hear the truth from my wife. But what I was about to hear wasn't the final truth. It was just the first layer of a cruel and calculated deception, a performance in which my wife and I were nothing more than puppets. A white-hot rage began to build in my chest, a pressure that radiated up to my temples, making my ears ring. But when I looked at my wife's gaunt, exhausted face and the dark circles under her eyes, I forced it all down. I sat down beside her on the sofa, took her ice-cold, trembling hand in mine, and I just listened. The story she told, piece by agonizing piece, painted a picture far worse than anything my most anxious mind could have ever conjured. It turned out that my parents' attentive care had been a complete charade that lasted for exactly 2 days, just long enough for her to report good things back to me. The moment they knew I was blissfully unaware, their true faces began to show. The nutritious meals stopped. Instead, they would leave whatever they hadn't finished from dinner the night before in the fridge, expecting her to reheat it herself. The house, which had always been cleaned twice a week by a professional service we hired, suddenly saw no sign of the housekeeper. When my wife surprised asked about it, my mother replied in a sickly sweet tone that she had let the service go to save money for the babies, and that a little gentle exercise would be good for her pregnancy. But the gentle exercise my mother spoke of was forcing a woman 5 months pregnant with twins, and so sick she could barely stand to scrub floors, do laundry for all 3 of them, and clean the entire 2-story house. The air in our home grew thick and cold, and the pungent chemical smell of bleach always seemed to linger, a scent that triggered my wife's nausea and made her already miserable days even worse. But that physical torment was nothing compared to the psychological game they were playing. My mother, it turned out, was a master of insidious cruelty. She turned my cousin Linda into a weapon. She never directly criticized my wife. Her method was far more sinister. She'd be watching TV, and a commercial for a luxury car would come on, and she'd sigh and say, "You know, Linda just bought one of these for herself. Her husband's business is doing so well because she's there helping him every day." At the dinner table, my father would bring up some investment, and my mother would jump in with, "We should ask Linda about that. She's so sharp with money, handles all the finances for their family." They painted this picture of a perfect, superhuman pregnant woman, and every word was a carefully aimed dart meant to make my wife feel weak, lazy, and utterly useless. I was floored. I couldn't sit there any longer. A primal rage, a protective instinct, so powerful it drowned out all reason, took over. I didn't say a word to my wife. I just stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the floor, and stormed out of the house. The drive to my parents' place was a blur of red tail lights and fury. I confronted them in their living room, my voice cracking with an anger I didn't know I possessed. At first, they played dumb. My mother put on the performance of a lifetime, her hand flying to her chest as if she'd been mortally wounded. She claimed my wife had completely misunderstood their good intentions, that she was being overly sensitive and hysterical because of the pregnancy hormones. My father stood by silently, his face a mask of disappointment, not in himself, but in me, as if I were the one who had committed some terrible betrayal. The confrontation ended in a stalemate. I left, choking on my own frustration and fury, a feeling of complete helplessness washing over me. But then, the most unexpected thing happened. The next morning, my father called me. On the other end of the line wasn't the defiant, disappointed man from the day before, but a broken, sobbing voice. He said they were wrong, that they were old and stupid and so stuck in their ways they didn't know how to act. He claimed they were just so scared and worried for their unborn grandchildren that they had acted foolishly, trying to toughen her up in the only way they knew how. He cried and he begged me, his only son, to give them a chance to apologize and make things right. I was completely thrown. A part of me screamed that it was all an act, but another more desperate part, the part that still wanted the loving parents from my childhood, wanted to believe him. After a long, difficult conversation with my wife, and after much persuading from my side, she reluctantly agreed to let them try. And then, the second act of their perfect performance began. My parents returned to our house, but as completely different people. They came bearing gifts, mountains of them, diner cribs, expensive strollers, the softest organic baby clothes. My mother spent her days cooking my wife's favorite meals, while my father insisted on massaging her swollen feet every evening. It was a whole song and dance, and they played their parts flawlessly. Our house was filled with laughter again, and I allowed myself to believe that the storm had passed, that I had my family back. I thought that confrontation had been the worst mistake of my life, but I was so wrong. This peace, it was too perfect, too beautiful to be real. Everything seemed to be settled, was even better than before, and I let myself sink into that false sense of security until one late night, weeks later. I went downstairs to get a glass of water, and as I walked past my parents' guest room, I saw the door was cracked open just a sliver. I was about to walk on, but then a familiar voice drifted out. It was my mother's voice, but the tone was all wrong. The warmth was gone, replaced by something cold, sharp, and calculating that I had never heard from her before. I froze, my hand hovering over the refrigerator door as I heard her whisper into the phone. The words she said sliced right through my fabricated tranquility. "Don't worry, he bought it hook, line, and sinker. My gullible son will be handing over all his money to us soon. His wife is no match for me." In that single whispered sentence from my mother, the entire set of my life came crashing down. The loving parents I thought I knew were just characters, and the comfortable family home was nothing but a stage. The curtain had fallen, and for the first time, I saw the puppeteers pulling the strings.
Ow.
But I still didn't understand the name of their play, or why I was the star. The linoleum floor felt like ice under my bare feet as I stood frozen in the hallway. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the muffled sounds of the refrigerator's hum growing loud and then fading into a dull roar in my ears. Hot blind rage had been easy to deal with. This was something else entirely. This was a cold, creeping dread that settled deep in my bones. My gullible son will be handing over all his money to us soon. The words echoed in my head, a nonsensical riddle wrapped in pure malice. Money? My parents had never been desperate for money. They lived comfortably, had a healthy retirement fund, and had never once asked me for a dime. What on earth was she talking about? It didn't make sense. And the part that chilled me the most was the cold, calculated certainty in her voice. This wasn't a wish, it was a statement of fact. It was the end goal of a plan already in motion. I backed away from their door silently, my heart hammering against my ribs. I went back to our bedroom and looked at my wife, sleeping peacefully, her hands resting protectively on her round belly. A wave of nausea hit me. I had brought these people, these strangers wearing my parents' faces, into our home. I had asked them to protect her, and instead, I had handed her over to the enemy. I knew right then that a direct confrontation would be pointless. They had lied to my face once before with tears and practiced apologies. They would do it again. They would twist my words, call me crazy, and probably even try to convince me I had imagined the whole thing. No, I couldn't fight them with accusations. I needed proof. I needed to understand what their endgame was. In that moment, I went from being a husband and a son to being a detective in my own home. The next morning was one of the hardest acting performances of my life. I had to sit at the breakfast table, smiling and making small talk with the two people I now knew were actively plotting against my family. My mother served me pancakes, her smile never reaching her eyes, and asked if I had slept well. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. After they left the house for one of their errands, I finally told my wife everything. I watched her face cycle through disbelief, then fear, and finally, a quiet, steely resolve that mirrored my own. She didn't cry, but she just took my hand and said, "Okay, what's the plan?" Our home was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a battlefield, and we needed to see our enemies' movements. That afternoon, I went to an electronics store and bought the smallest, most discreet security cameras I could find. It felt like a scene out of a spy movie, my hands sweating as I paid in cash, my eyes darting around as if I were some kind of criminal. That evening, while my wife took my parents out to dinner under the guise of a thank-you meal, I turned our house upside down. I placed a camera in the corner of the living room, hidden amongst the books on a high shelf. Another went into the kitchen, tucked into a fake plant. The most important one I placed in my home office, the place where I kept all our financial documents, its tiny lens peeking out from a digital clock on my desk. Installing surveillance in the house I grew up visiting, targeting the people who raised me, felt like a profound violation, a line I never thought I'd cross, but they had crossed it first. With the stage set, we began phase 2, the bait. We started having loud stage conversations in the living room, knowing they were always listening. I'd talked to my wife about the huge bonus I was getting from the project. I'd mentioned that we were thinking of selling off some stocks to set up a massive college fund for the twins. We'd discuss our savings, our investments, casually dropping numbers that I knew would make their ears perk up, and it worked. Later that night, I'd sit in the dark of my office watching the footage on my laptop. I saw it in their eyes. We mentioned money, their posture would change. They would stop pretending to read their books and exchange quick, subtle glances, their eyes gleaming with a greedy light. It was sickening to watch, but it confirmed one thing. This was, without a doubt, all about the money. The question was still, why? The answer came from a place I never expected. A few days later, my phone rang. It was my aunt, my father's younger sister. We weren't incredibly close, but we always exchanged pleasantries on holidays. Her voice on the phone sounded strained. After a few minutes of small talk, she hesitated and then said, "Look, I might be overstepping here, and if I am, just tell me to mind my own business." But I heard something, and it's been eating me alive. A cold, knot formed in my stomach. She told me she had run into a distant family friend who mentioned, in passing, that they were so sorry to hear about my parents' financial troubles. My aunt had been confused, and when she pressed the friend for details, the story came tumbling out. Before I tell you what she said, you need to understand something about my parents. They are proud people. The idea of admitting failure, especially financial failure, is like a death sentence to them. My aunt explained that for the past year, my parents had poured their entire life savings into a miracle real estate investment opportunity. An opportunity brought to them by none other than my perfect cousin, Linda. It wasn't an investment. It was a classic pyramid scheme, and Linda was one of the key players at the top. The entire thing had collapsed a few months ago, and my parents had lost everything. Not just their savings, but they had also taken out a second mortgage on their home, and were now drowning in a life-shattering amount of debt. They were facing foreclosure, total ruin, and they hadn't told a single soul, least of all me. Suddenly, every bizarre, cruel piece of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The cruelty towards my wife wasn't just them being old-fashioned. It was step one. Their plan, my aunt explained through horrified whispers, was to create a crisis. They needed to make my wife seem unstable, incompetent, and weak in my eyes. They were stressing her out intentionally, hoping that I would see her as a liability. As someone who couldn't handle the pressures of motherhood and managing a household, step 2 was the fake apology, the performance of a lifetime designed to win back my trust and make them look like the caring, responsible grandparents. And step 3, the final act, was to convince me, their gullible son, that with such an unstable wife, I needed someone wise and experienced to help manage my finances. They were going to manipulate me into giving them control of our money, not to invest it, but to funnel it into the black hole of their debt to save themselves. The phone call ended, and I just sat there, the silence of the room pressing in on me. They weren't just cruel, they were desperate. And their desperation had turned them into monsters, willing to sacrifice my wife's health and the safety of their own grandchildren on the altar of their pride. I felt a surge of adrenaline and went straight to the camera footage from the night before, my fingers flying across the trackpad. I knew what I was looking for now, and then I found it. Timestamp read 2:17 a.m. The footage from my office was grainy in the low light. I saw the door creak open, and my mother slipped into the room. My blood ran cold as I watched her sit down in my chair, her face illuminated by the blue glow of my laptop screen as she opened it. She was trying to access my saved passwords, her movements quick and furtive. A moment later, my father appeared in the doorway behind her. He wasn't stopping her. He was her lookout. He leaned in close and whispered something, a sound so low the camera's microphone barely picked it up. But I cranked up the volume and listened again, and I heard it clearly. I heard him say, "He's not going to just give it to us. We need him to sign the power of attorney papers. We have to make him believe she's a danger to his future." How do you confront a monster that wears your mother's face? You don't. You build a cage, you lay the bait, and you let the monster trap itself. The days of me being the victim were over. I had the truth, and I was about to turn it into a weapon. The video file felt like it was burning a hole in my laptop's hard drive. It was the single ugliest thing I had ever seen, a raw, unfiltered recording of greed and betrayal. My first instinct was pure, primal rage. I wanted to storm into their room, shove the laptop in their faces, and watch their world crumble. But my wife, with a calm that I couldn't possibly muster, put a hand on my arm. She reminded me that we were dealing with seasoned manipulators. Simple accusation would just lead to more lies, more gaslighting. They would call the video a fake claim. I was trying to frame them. To truly end this, we had to do more than just show them the evidence. We had to make them walk into their own trap, willingly and eagerly. And so, in the quiet darkness of our bedroom, with the villains sleeping just down the hall, my wife and I formulated a plan. It was a cold, methodical process, and I felt like a stranger in my own life, plotting the downfall of my own parents. The next morning, I put on my game face. I walked into the kitchen, where my mother was humming and making coffee, and I told her that I had been doing a lot of thinking. I explained that, with the twins on the way, I was feeling overwhelmed by our financial responsibilities. I told her I was worried about my wife's fragile emotional state, and that I thought it would be best if someone with more experience helped manage our portfolio for a while. It was disgusting, using their own cruel narrative against them, and every word felt like acid in my mouth. But I watched my mother's eyes, and I saw a flicker of triumph, a predatory gleam that she tried and failed to hide. She placed a comforting hand on my arm, her touch making my skin crawl, and said that she and my father would be honored to help in any way they could. The bait was laid. I told them I had a lawyer friend who could draft the necessary paperwork, and that I'd have him come by the house the next day to make it all official. The next 24 hours were the most tense of my life. My parents were practically glowing with anticipation. They were overly affectionate, constantly telling me what a good, smart son I was for making such a wise decision. They treated my wife with a condescending sort of pity, as if she were a child who needed to be managed. The air in the house was thick with their lies and our silence. Every clink of a spoon against a mug sounded like a gunshot in the tense quiet. The next afternoon, our doorbell rang. My friend David, who was actually a high school drama teacher and not a lawyer, stood on our porch. He looked the part perfectly, dressed in a sharp suit, carrying a leather briefcase, and wearing a pair of non-prescription glasses that made him look serious and intellectual. I had given him the full story, and he was more than willing to play his part. I introduced him to my parents as my attorney. My father shook his hand vigorously, a wide, fake smile plastered on his face. My mother offered him coffee, her voice dripping with charm. We all sat down at the dining room table. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, making the whole scene feel surreal. David opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. They were actually just blank pages with a fancy-looking cover sheet I had printed out. He slid them across the table towards me. "This is the standard power of attorney agreement we discussed," he said, his voice a perfect imitation of a bored professional lawyer. "It will grant your parents full discretionary control over the accounts listed." I watched my parents as they stared at the documents. Their eyes were wide with a hunger so naked it was obscene. This was it. This was the moment they had schemed and lied and hurt my wife for. My father reached for the pen on the table, his hand slightly trembling with excitement. My mother was practically vibrating in her seat. They were so close they could taste it. I let my father pick up the pen. I let him unscrew the cap. And just as the nib was about to touch the paper, I said, "Hold on. There's just one more thing." They both looked up, their faces a mixture of confusion and annoyance at the interruption. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small Bluetooth speaker, placing it in the center of the table. I didn't say another word. I just pressed play on my phone. The first thing that filled the silent room was the sound of my mother's voice, tinny and distorted, but unmistakably hers. "Don't worry, he bought it hook, line, and sinker. My gullible son will be handing over all his money to us soon. His wife is no match for me." The color drained from my mother's face. My father froze, the pen hovering over the paper, his jaw slack. They stared at the speaker as if it were a venomous snake. But I wasn't done. I turned my laptop around on the table so it faced them, and I played the video from my office. I made them watch themselves, two shadowy figures in the dark, conspiring to ruin their own son. I made them watch my mother trying to hack into my computer. I made them listen to my father's whisper, now crystal clear in the silent room. "We need him to sign the power of attorney papers. We have to make him believe she's a danger to his future." The video ended. The silence that followed was deafening. It was a heavy, suffocating silence filled with the wreckage of a family. My father dropped the pen. It clattered on the polished wood of the table, the only sound in the room. He slumped in his chair, his face ashen, looking like a man who had aged 20 years in 20 seconds. He couldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at his hands, a broken man. My mother, however, was a different story. The shock on her face curdled into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Her eyes, which had been filled with fake sympathy just minutes before, were now blazing with hatred. She wasn't sorry. She was just sorry she got caught. She opened her mouth, and what came out wasn't an apology, but a torrent of venom. She screamed that my wife had bewitched me, that she was a manipulative snake who had turned me against my own family. She called me an ungrateful fool. I let her scream until she ran out of breath. And then, in a voice that was eerily calm, I said, "It was never about the money. I would have given you anything if you had just asked. It was about this." I pointed to my wife, who was standing in the doorway, her face pale, but her eyes strong. "It was about the fact that you were willing to destroy her, to risk the health of your own grandchildren, all to save yourselves from the consequences of your own stupid mistakes. You're not just bad with money, you're bad people." I stood up. "David, thank you for coming." My friend nodded, packed his briefcase, and quietly left. I then turned back to the two people at my table. "The performance is over," I said, my voice cold as ice. "Get out of my house now." They left. My father walked out like a zombie, not looking at anything. My mother, however, stopped at the door. She turned around, and the look she gave me was one of pure, venomous hatred. It was a look that promised retribution. She didn't have to say a word. I knew this wasn't the end. But as she stood there, silhouetted in the doorway, she finally spoke, her voice a low, threatening hiss that sent a chill down my spine. "You will regret this," she said. "You will never, ever know peace." My mother's final words were a curse, a prophecy of a life without peace. And in the deafening silence after they left, as I held my trembling wife, I was terrified she might be right. How can you find peace when you know the two people who gave you life were willing to destroy it? The first few days after the confrontation were strange. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. The tense, suffocating silence that had been pressing down on us was gone. In its place was a clean, empty silence. My wife and I didn't talk much about what had happened. We didn't need to. We just existed in this new, fragile space together, slowly cleaning out the poison that had seeped into the walls of our home. We removed the expensive gifts they had brought, donating them to a local shelter. We reclaimed our space, room by room. And with every passing day, the air felt a little lighter, a little warmer. Was this the peace she swore I'd never have? It was a start. 2 months later, my wife gave birth to our twins, a boy and a girl, both healthy and screaming with life. The moment I held them, one in each arm, something inside me shifted forever. The lingering anger and betrayal I held towards my parents didn't vanish. But it was dwarfed by this new, all-consuming love. The world shrank until it was just the four of us. The sweet scent of baby powder and milk replaced the chemical smell of bleach. The sound of their tiny breaths replaced the echo of my mother's hateful words. Our house was no longer quiet. It was filled with the chaotic, beautiful noise of a new family, and every cry, every gurgle, was a note in the song of our true peace. About a month after the babies were born, I got another call from my aunt. Her voice was heavy with a sad sort of finality. She told me the news she had been hearing through the family grapevine. The pyramid scheme had completely imploded, and the fallout was worse than anyone imagined. Dozens of families had been ruined. There were lawsuits, and my cousin Linda was apparently at the center of it all. As for my parents, their world had completely fallen apart. They had lost their house to the bank. They had burned every bridge to save a house they ended up losing anyway. I didn't feel joy hearing this. I didn't feel a sense of victory. I just felt a profound, hollow sadness for the two people they had become, and for the parents I had lost long before they walked out my door. Life moved on. We were so wrapped up in the whirlwind of diapers, feedings, and sleepless nights that the drama with my parents began to feel like a story that had happened to someone else. And then one Saturday morning, it all came rushing back. The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent. I looked through the peephole and my heart dropped. It was them. They stood on our porch, but they looked different. They were thinner, their faces etched with a bitterness that seemed to have aged them a decade. They looked like ghosts haunting their own past. This was the scene from the very beginning, the moment I told you about. My wife took the babies into the back room, and I opened the door. My mother didn't even say hello. She just looked at me with those same dead, hateful eyes and said the words, "We're here to inform you that you are no longer our son." She thrust a thick envelope into my hand. I didn't even need to read it. She told me, her voice dripping with spite, that they were leaving everything they had, which I now knew was a whole lot of nothing but debt to their truly devoted daughter, Linda. It was their final pathetic attempt to hurt me, their last performance in a play that had already ended. They expected me to be devastated. They wanted me to beg, to rage, to show them I was in pain. I just looked at her, at this stranger standing on my porch, and I felt nothing but pity. I didn't say a word, just nodded, closed the door gently in their faces, and locked it. I walked to the kitchen and dropped the envelope into the trash can without even opening it. It was in that moment that I finally understood. My mother's curse was powerless. Her idea of peace was conditional, was something she could grant or take away. But she was wrong. My peace wasn't in her forgiveness or her approval. My peace was in the sound of my wife humming to our daughter in the next room. My peace was in the weight of my son sleeping on my chest. They couldn't take that away from me. They had tried, and they had failed. A few months after that, my wife and I were at the local grocery store. As we were walking down the cereal aisle, I saw them. They were at the other end, looking at canned soup. They saw us at the same time. There was a moment of frozen, awkward silence. And then, in a childish theatrical display, they both turned their faces away, making a whole show of pretending we didn't exist. And I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel sadness. I just felt nothing. They were just two unhappy old people in a grocery store, and their story had nothing to do with mine anymore. I had finally found the truth about my parents' cruelty, and it was uglier than I could have imagined. But in uncovering their deception, I accidentally discovered a much deeper truth about the meaning of family. Family isn't just about the blood you share. It's about the people you choose to protect, the people you build your peace with. And my family, my real family, was right here with me.